Everyone calls it the worst shark attack in history. And technically, that is true. When the USS Indianapolis sank in the Philippine Sea on July 30th, 1945, nearly 900 men went into the water. When rescue arrived 4 days later, only 316 were still alive. Somewhere between 150 and 200 of those deaths are attributed to shark attacks, making it, by recorded numbers, the largest mass shark attack event in human history. But here is what the survivors themselves said, the men who were actually there, floating in that water for 84 hours, when they were asked what really killed their friends. They didn't say sharks. Survivor Dr. Haynes, the ship's chief medical officer, spent all 4 days swimming between groups of men, keeping them alive as long as he could. When he talked about what killed the men around him, he said, "The real young ones, you take away their hope, you take away their water and food, they would drink salt water and then would go fast." Survivor Dick Thelen said, "I'd seen a lot of guys just crack, drink the water or give up, or they'd swim off to imaginary islands." Survivor Woody Eugene James described men going, in his words, berserk. He testified that they were telling each other the Indianapolis was not sunk, that it was just below the surface, and they could swim down and get fresh water from the galley. Men swam down and never came back up. Dr. Haynes watched men who had started to hallucinate turn on the living. "There's a Jap here and he's trying to kill me," they would shout. And then, in the grip of a delusion they could not escape, they would attack their own shipmates. In a single 10-minute episode on the third day, an estimated 50 men killed each other in a melee of delusional violence. 50 men, 10 minutes, killed by their own friends who no longer knew where they were or who they were fighting. The sharks were there. The sharks were real. The sharks were terrifying, but the sharks were not the main killer. This is the story of what actually happened to the men of the USS Indianapolis in those 84 hours. And as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Let's start from the moment the ship went down, because the first hours are crucial to understanding everything that followed. The Indianapolis sank at approximately 12:14 in the morning on July 30th, 1945. 2 Japanese torpedoes. 12 minutes from first impact to the ship disappearing beneath the surface. Of 1,195 men aboard, approximately 300 went down with the ship, killed in the explosions or trapped below as she sank. That left approximately 890 men in the water. Those 890 men were scattered across a large area of ocean. The ship had been moving when she sank, so men had entered the water at different points across several hundred meters. In the dark, covered in black fuel oil that had spilled from the ship's ruptured tanks, they could hear each other, but often could not see each other. The fuel oil was everywhere. It coated their skin, their hair, their eyes. It got into their mouths when they swallowed water. It burned in their eyes and blurred their vision. Survivor Dr. Haynes later said, "We all looked the same, black oil all over, white eyes and red mouths. You couldn't tell the doctor from the boot seaman." Soon, everyone had swallowed fuel oil and gotten sick. A small number of life rafts had been successfully launched from the ship. These became the most desperately sought objects in the water. Men fought their way toward them, knowing that a raft meant something to hold on to, something to pull your exhausted body partially out of the water. There were not nearly enough rafts. Most men had only their kapok life jackets, the standard Navy flotation device of the era. The kapok life jacket worked on a simple principle. Inside the jacket was a dense fibrous material called kapok, derived from the seed pods of tropical trees that trapped air and provided buoyancy. A fully saturated kapok jacket could keep a man's head above water without any effort from the man himself. The problem was that kapok absorbs water over time. The longer it stays submerged, the heavier it gets and the less buoyancy it provides. After approximately 48 hours, 2 days, a heavily waterlogged kapok jacket provides significantly reduced lift. After 4 days, a man relying on a saturated kapok jacket has to work to stay afloat. The men of the Indianapolis would be in the water for 84 hours, 3.5 days, well past the point where their jackets could be fully relied upon. Now let's talk about what their bodies were already dealing with in just the first few hours. The Philippine Sea in late July is warm, approximately 28 degrees Celsius at the surface. That warmth was both a blessing and a curse. The blessing was that it was not cold enough to cause immediate hypothermia. Men in the North Atlantic during winter could be incapacitated by hypothermia within 30 to 60 minutes. These men would not face that immediate killer, though, as we will see, as the nights set in, the temperature drop would eventually become a serious problem. The curse was everything else the warm tropical water brought with it. The fuel oil burned. It reacted with the salt water around the men's skin. Men had blisters on their shoulders from their life preservers, blisters on top of blisters. Every movement rubbed raw skin against more raw skin. As dawn broke on July 30th, the Pacific sun rose and began to hammer directly down on the men with no shelter of any kind. The air temperature above the water surface quickly reached 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. They had no hats, no shade, no cover. Exposed skin, faces, necks, arms, the backs of hands began to burn within an hour of sunrise. By midday on day 1, many of the men had severe sunburn across every exposed surface. By day 2, that sunburn had progressed to blistering. The combination of sun exposure and salt water caused desquamation, severe peeling of the skin that exposed deeper flesh beneath. Moving in the water rubbed the exposed flesh against the salt water constantly. And through all of this, the burns, the oil, the blistering, the rubbing of the life jackets against raw skin, came the thirst. Here is the central, uncomfortable truth of what happened in the Philippine Sea over those 4 days. The sharks killed between 150 and 200 men. The estimates vary, and in the chaos of those 4 days, no one was counting. The sharks mostly fed off the bodies of sailors who had already died from other things. They were terrifying, they were real, but the number 150 to 200, even at the highest estimate, accounts for roughly 25% of the deaths. The other 75% of the men who died in the water, approximately 450 to 500 people, were killed primarily by dehydration, saltwater poisoning, and the hallucinations and violence that followed from them. Let's talk about the science of what thirst does to the human body and mind, because this is the process that drove most of the deaths. The human body is approximately 60% water. Every system in the body requires water to function: circulation, digestion, kidney function, temperature regulation, brain function. When water intake stops and the body begins to lose water faster than it takes it in, dehydration sets in. In normal conditions, with no food or water, a person begins to feel significantly impaired after approximately 24 hours. In the conditions these men were experiencing, intense tropical sun, physical exertion treading water, fuel oil in their systems causing vomiting, the timeline was compressed dramatically. Within 12 to 24 hours, intense thirst, dry mouth, headaches, dizziness. Within 24 to 36 hours, the throat becomes so dry that swallowing is painful. The eyes begin to sink into the skull. The skin loses elasticity. Cognitive function begins to deteriorate. Decisions become harder. Concentration becomes difficult. Emotional stability decreases. Within 36 to 72 hours, severe cognitive impairment, confusion, disorientation, the inability to distinguish reality from hallucination. At this stage, the brain is so water-deprived that it is physically shrinking away from the walls of the skull, a process that causes severe headaches and fundamentally disrupts neurological function. And surrounding these men, in every direction for as far as they could see, was water. The Pacific Ocean contains approximately 35 grams of salt per liter of water.
The human kidneys can process and excrete a maximum of approximately 10 grams of salt per liter of urine. This means that for every liter of seawater a person drinks, the body requires more than 3 liters of fresh water to process and eliminate the salt. Drinking seawater does not hydrate. It accelerates dehydration at a catastrophic rate. Every man in the water knew this. They had been trained. The doctors and medical personnel among them repeated it constantly. Do not drink the seawater. But by the second day, hundreds of survivors succumbed to heat and thirst or suffered hallucinations that compelled them to drink the seawater around them, a sentence of death by salt poisoning. Those who slaked their thirst would slip into a state of delirium, foaming at the mouth as their tongues and lips swelled. They often became as great a threat to the survivors as the sharks circling below. Many dragged their comrades underwater with them as they died. What seawater poisoning does, specifically, is this. The massive salt load forces the brain to pull water from its own cells in a desperate attempt to process and eliminate the sodium. This cellular dehydration of the brain causes rapid neurological deterioration, but before it shuts down completely, the brain generates vivid, convincing, terrifying hallucinations. The hallucinations of the Indianapolis survivors are documented in extraordinary detail in their testimonies because they were so specific, so consistent, and so horrifying that the men never forgot them.
The survivors experienced hallucinations, the Indianapolis returning to pick them up, a small island made entirely of vanilla ice cream, or that their neighbor was actually a Japanese spy. Let's stay with those for a moment, because each one reveals something specific about what the dehydrated, salt-poisoned brain was doing. The Indianapolis returning below the surface. This was the most common hallucination, reported by multiple survivors. Survivor Woody Eugene James testified, "They'd tell you big stories about the Indianapolis is not sunk, it's just right there under the surface. I was just down there and had a drink of water." Men dove beneath the surface to enter the ship. They were looking for the water fountain on the second deck. They were looking for the galley. They dove down and did not come back up. The island on the horizon, this hallucination killed men in groups. Dr. Haynes described it, "One day everyone got in a long line. I said, 'What are you doing?' Someone answered, 'Doctor, there's an island up ahead. One of us can go ashore at a time and you can get 15 minutes sleep.' They all saw the island. You couldn't convince them otherwise. Even I fought hallucinations on and off, but something always brought me back." Think about what that means. Dr. Haynes was a trained physician who knew exactly what was happening to his brain. He knew the island was not real, and still he had to actively fight the hallucination. For men with no medical training, men who were younger, more exhausted, more severely dehydrated, the island was completely real. They swam for it. They swam until they were too far from the group to be seen. They swam until they drowned. The Japanese spy hallucination was the deadliest of all. Dr. Haynes described men who believed, "There's a Jap here and he's trying to kill me." And then everybody started to fight. They were totally out of their minds. These were men who had just come from a war zone. They had been sunk by a Japanese submarine. The enemy was real to them, present in every sense of the word. When the dehydrated brain began generating hallucinations, it reached for the thing these men feared most. And in the grip of that hallucination, completely convinced they were fighting for their lives against an enemy combatant, they attacked their friends. In a matter of 10 minutes, an estimated 50 men were killed. The melee had the intensity of a flash fire. 50 men in 10 minutes, killed not by Japanese torpedoes, not by sharks, not by the ocean, but by their own shipmates who could no longer tell friend from enemy. Through all of this, through the hallucinations, the shark attacks, the dying men, the sun, the fuel oil, the salt water, one man spent all 84 hours doing what he could to keep the living alive. Dr. Lewis Haynes was 33 years old. He was from the small town of Manistee, Michigan. He was the ship's chief medical officer, and when the Indianapolis went down, he had been asleep in his cabin in his pajamas. He made it into the water. He had no medical supplies, no drugs, no bandages, no equipment, just his knowledge and his willingness to keep moving. Covered in fuel oil, Dr. Haynes swam from group to group. He would call out to the sailors, "Are you still with us?" If a man's eyes were bloodshot and swollen, a sign of saltwater ingestion, and there was no reflex when the doctor tapped an eyeball, Haynes reluctantly declared the sailor dead. Then came the task of removing the dead man's life jacket and giving it to someone still alive who didn't have one. He loosened the straps, he eased out the shoulders, then the arms. The body slid free. He moved to the next man. As dead men accumulated, Haynes later reported, "We would laboriously take off their life jacket and give it to men who didn't have jackets. In the beginning, I took off their dog tags, said the Lord's Prayer, and let them go. Eventually, I got such an armful of dog tags I couldn't hold them any longer. Even today, when I try to say the Lord's Prayer or hear it, I simply lose it." He warned men constantly against drinking seawater. He talked to men who were hallucinating, trying to bring them back. He tore the bottom of his pajamas into strips and used them to dress wounds. He had men lock arms and tried to keep groups together. He did all of this for 84 hours, in the water, without sleeping, without food, without fresh water, while suffering the same dehydration and exposure as everyone else around him. He was burning from the outside, the sun, the oil, the salt water, and depleting from the inside. He survived. He was one of the 316. For the rest of his life, he could not say the Lord's Prayer without breaking down. Every time he tried, he was back in the water, dog tags accumulating on his arm, the ocean taking men one by one. Now let's talk about the sharks, because they were there, and they were horrifying, and they deserve an honest account. The species primarily responsible for the attacks was the oceanic white-tip shark, a deep-water species that marine biologists consider one of the most dangerous in open ocean. Unlike the more famous great white shark, which tends to make single exploratory bites, oceanic whitetips are persistent. They circle. They test. When they commit to an attack, they do not let go easily. The explosion that sank the Indianapolis sent massive amounts of blood, tissue, and organic material into the water. In the warm Philippine Sea, these traces dispersed across enormous distances. Oceanic whitetips can detect blood in concentrations of 1 part per million. Effectively, 1 drop of blood in an Olympic swimming pool. The sharks were drawn from miles away. Survivor Lowell Cox later reported, "They were continually there, mostly feeding off the dead bodies, but then the sharks began attacking men who were still alive. We were losing 3 or 4 each night and day. You were constantly in fear because you'd see them all the time. Every few minutes you'd see their fins, 12 to 24 fins in the water." The sharks tended to attack at dawn and dusk, the low light periods when visibility in the water is poor and the sharks' sensory advantages over humans are at their maximum. During the day, with men actively moving and grouped together, the sharks were more cautious. Men on the edges of groups were most at risk. Men who had drifted away, whether through exhaustion, death, or hallucination-induced drowning, their bodies became what the sharks fed on. The shark attacks on living men were real. They happened. People died from them. But the image of hundreds of men systematically hunted down by sharks over 4 days is not what the survivors described. What they described was something more complicated and in many ways more disturbing. An ocean full of men slowly losing their minds while sharks circled in the dark around the edges. Let's put the specific numbers together, because this is the part that reframes the entire story. Of the approximately 890 men who entered the water when the Indianapolis sank, approximately 300 had gone down with the ship, killed in the explosions or drowned during the sinking. These deaths happened before the survival ordeal even began. Of the 890 in the water, approximately 574 died before rescue arrived. Shark attacks. Estimates range from 80 to 200 deaths. The most commonly cited figure among historians is approximately 150. Taking the highest estimate, 200, that represents approximately 35% of the deaths in the water. The remaining 65%, approximately 374 men, died from dehydration, saltwater poisoning, the hallucinations and violence those conditions caused, drowning from exhaustion or disorientation, hypothermia during the cold Pacific nights, injuries from the initial explosions that became fatal over the days in the water, and, in some cases, simply giving up. By about 55 hours into the ordeal, slightly more than half of the 900 or so who had left the ship were still alive. Men had been dying at an average rate of 1 every 10 minutes for the past 3 days. The salt water was even dissolving hair from some of their bodies. After another cold night in the water, the men's body temperatures hovered around 88 degrees Fahrenheit, precariously within the coma zone. 1 death every 10 minutes for 3 days straight. Not from sharks, from everything else. The investigators found themselves confronted with a series of questions that, taken individually, might each have a plausible answer, but taken together, they formed a picture that refused to resolve into anything coherent. Question 1. Why did all 9 hikers leave the tent without their boots in negative 30-degree cold? The most accepted explanation is that something happened inside or immediately outside the tent that caused them to panic and flee. The tent was cut from the inside. This indicates urgency, a need to escape that was so immediate that using the door was not possible. Something frightened them badly enough that they chose the certainty of the cold over whatever was in or near that tent. But what? Question 2. Why did some of them walk away calmly? The footprints in the snow showed something strange. Most of the 9 people who walked away from the tent walked in an orderly fashion, not running, not stumbling, but walking steadily, in the dark, in negative 30 degrees, without boots. This is not how panicking people walk. This is how people who are trying to be calm, who are trying to do something methodically, walk. What were they trying to do? Question 3. What caused the internal injuries to the final 4? This is the central unanswered question. The internal injuries to Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Thibault-Brignol, and Kolevatov were catastrophic and specific. Crushed chests, shattered skulls, internal bleeding, all without external marks. The forensic examiner explicitly said these injuries were not caused by a human being. Then what caused them? Question 4. Where was Ludmila Dubinina's tongue? The most unsettling detail in the entire case. Multiple forensic examinations have been conducted over the decades, and the explanations offered range from post-mortem decomposition in the running water of the ravine, the body was found submerged, to scavenging by small animals. But some forensic experts have noted that the precision of the missing tissue does not match what decomposition or animal scavenging typically produces. The answer remains genuinely uncertain. Question 6. Why was some of the clothing radioactive? When the clothing of several victims was tested, some items showed levels of radioactive contamination significantly above background levels. This was particularly true of items belonging to Krivonishenko, who had worked at a Soviet nuclear facility. One explanation is simple contamination from his workplace. Clothes worn during work at a nuclear plant might retain trace amounts of radiation. But other items also showed elevated readings, and the precise levels have been disputed in various accounts. In 1959, in the Soviet Union, radioactive contamination on the clothing of dead citizens was not something the government wanted to discuss publicly. Question 7. What were the glowing orange spheres?
Multiple witnesses, including another group of hikers approximately 50 kilometers to the south on the night of February 1st, as well as meteorology service personnel and military observers, reported seeing orange or glowing spheres over the northern Urals on the night the Dyatlov group disappeared. These reports came from different locations, from independent observers with no connection to each other, and were consistent in their descriptions. The Soviet investigators in 1959 chose not to include these sightings in the official investigation. The witnesses who gave their accounts did so years later, when it became somewhat safer to talk about such things. What were the spheres? Possible explanations include military test rockets, parachute flares from military exercises, or atmospheric phenomena. But no specific military exercise or test launch has ever been confirmed that matches the time and location.
The men who survived the Indianapolis carried it with them forever. Most did not talk about it for decades. Their families often found out their fathers or grandfathers had been on the ship, not from the men themselves, but from watching the movie Jaws, specifically the scene where the character of Quint delivers his monologue about the Indianapolis. Children would come to their fathers and say, "Was that you?" And the fathers would say, "Yes." And often that was all they would say. But some of them did eventually speak. They gave oral histories. They agreed to interviews. They testified before Congress. And across all of those testimonies, across all the different men who experienced different parts of those 84 hours, certain things were said consistently. The sharks were not the worst part. The thirst was worse than the sharks. The hallucinations were worse than the sharks. Watching a friend swim away toward an island that wasn't there and knowing you couldn't bring him back, that was worse than the sharks. Watching a man you had served with, whose family you knew, whose face was familiar to you, turn on you in a delusion and try to kill you, that was worse than the sharks. Survivor Dick Thelen put it simply. I'd seen a lot of guys just crack, drink the water or give up, or they'd swim off to imaginary islands. Crack, give up, swim off to imaginary islands. Not eaten, not taken, not pulled under by a fin breaking the surface. They left by choice, by the terrible, irrational, hallucinatory choice of a brain that had been stripped of water and hope and reason. They swam towards something they could see and we could not, in a direction that led nowhere until the ocean took them. That is what killed the men of the USS Indianapolis, not the sharks.
Hello everyone, my name is Brian, and welcome back to the channel. Everyone calls the Indianapolis disaster the worst shark attack in history, and the sharks were real. I don't want to minimize what those men faced in the water, but the survivors themselves told us something different. They told us that what broke them was not the predators in the water. It was the water itself, the sun, the thirst, the moment a man's mind turns on him in a way he cannot fight or flee from. The last survivor of the Indianapolis, Harold Bray, who was 17 years old when the ship went down, is still alive. He is in his late 90s, living in Benicia, California. His hometown erected a life-sized bronze statue of him as that young sailor. When asked about the memorial, he responded with quiet humility. He doesn't talk about it much. Most of them didn't. If this video gave you something to think about, I would really appreciate a like. It helps this channel reach more people. And if you have a story suggestion, the form is in the description. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.